Well, good Wednesday evening, everyone. Scotty Power here with the Carolinas Weather Group, and we want to thank you for joining us on November the 5th, just a little bit after 8 o'clock as we were trying to get all our guests and computer problems and all that worked out, but I think we're good. We're missing one panelist, Ricky Matthews. He is on his way back from class, so he'll be here shortly. And then our guest Brad Panovich, will be here in just a little bit. He's taking care of some family things, trying to get the kids to bed. So once he does that, we will have a full panel tonight, and we have an awesome topic we're discussing tonight: the Carolina Wedge, cold air damming. We've so many words to explain the phenomenon that happens here in North and South Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia. It really has an impact on the whole entire Southeast. We have a great panel of meteorologists and our own panelists to kind of talk about the effects of the cold air damming tonight. So with that, I'm Scotty Powell again. I work with Burke Weather. I'm going to kind of let our panelists introduce themselves, and then I'll introduce our guests. And we're going to kind of talk a little bit about last week's weather, as we had a crazy week of weather. We're going to kind of hit on that before we go into the main topic of our show tonight. So with that, I'm going to toss it just to my west and give it to Daniel Crawley, who covers the mountains for us.
Thank you, Scotty. Glad to have everyone on tonight. My name's Daniel Crawley, based in Marion, North Carolina. And like Scotty said, it's been an interesting little bit of weather over about the past week or so. Of course, we had that cold blast come in on Saturday, and that very strong, very abnormally strong upper-level low that brought the first snow of the year to the southern Appalachian region. Had a lot of areas like Asheville had about 3 inches of snow. Places like Waynesville had about 3 or 4 inches of snow. And then as you headed into the higher elevations, like the northern mountains and then into the Smokies, those totals went up big time, anywhere from 1 to almost 2 feet in some areas. So our first taste of winter weather here in the southern Appalachian region, and boy, was it interesting to say the least. Here in McDowell County, we didn't get any snow, didn't even get any snow flurries, but it was cold and very windy on Saturday. We had wind gusts regularly in the high 30s, maybe even close to low 40-mile-per-hour range, and the winds even held on quite a bit into Sunday. It was pretty brisk even on Sunday. Winds were probably more 10 to 15 range at that point. But all in all, a taste of winter. Here in the last couple of days, it's been a little bit warmer, but looks like that's going to change toward the weekend as well. So here we are in November, where crazy things can happen, and that's been the case for sure. I guess we'll go east a little bit. We'll go to Mr. Joey Mosteller in Catawba County.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, Catawba County, was a little shut out of the snow, which we kind of figured that we were too far east to really see anything in that craziness. But me and Scotty took it upon ourselves to head up the mountain Saturday to see some snow. And I think, Daniel, some of your higher elevations area in McDowell County probably saw some flurries, because we were pretty close to McDowell County. In fact, we might have been in McDowell County at some point. But anyway, we were all over the place.
I'm telling you, we covered the entire North Carolina-Tennessee line Saturday.
Yeah. To the point where Ricky and Scotty's pictures made it onto Good Morning America Sunday morning. So they were stealing some pictures. But anyway, we had a blast. We ended up, oddly enough, without planning, we ended up seeing Ricky up on the top of, toward the top of Roan Mountain. I guess good weather chasers end up in the same spot from time to time. So we were sitting there, and we saw some guys standing over near the North Carolina state line sign, and they all had their little anemometers up in there, and we're like, who are these people? And then they came walking towards us, and sure enough, it was Ricky. So we ended up in the same point, in a very interesting area of weather. In fact, I'll just kick it over to Ricky for a second. Ricky, why don't you, because you actually hiked back a little ways off from the parking lot. What did you see up there?
Yeah, we made the smart or maybe not smart decision. I still haven't decided yet, because I'm still kind of frozen in my brain from the wind chills that were up there. And the temperatures of 20 degrees is about a wind chill of -5 on top of the mountain. But as Joey mentioned,
and I didn't even have a jacket on.
Yeah, and Joey's out there in a t-shirt, so go figure. But yeah, we hiked a little bit up the Appalachian Trail towards a place called, Round Bald was the peak. It's about 300 feet higher than the Carver's Gap area there, where we were. and we ended up encountering a snowdrift. I think the max we saw was around 26 inches or so. I stepped in and it went almost up to my waist. It was so deep. So it was a pretty deep snowdrift, and out there we had visibilities that were, I would say, nearing blizzard conditions. Probably not officially because the winds weren't up that strong all the time. We were having gusts occasionally to 40 miles per hour. And an interesting story to tell. On the hike up the mountain, we actually found a little kid in the woods who had become separated from his dad, and we ended up finding his dad afterwards. But on the way back down the mountain, I actually did the exact same thing the kid did, and I wandered off the trail. And all three of my other friends followed me because the snow was blowing straight in your face. You couldn't actually see where you were going too well. And just like the kid did, he walked right off the trail. And I look around, I'm like, where's the trail? And so it took us about another 30 seconds or so to try to figure out where it was and get back on it. But I can easily see how you can become lost and disoriented out there when conditions are like that.
Yeah, no doubt. It was. I was saying before we came on that it was really interesting because Scotty stopped, did a little video, we took a couple of pictures, less than maybe a mile down the mountain where we were, and it was snowing, but it was nothing like what it was up there, which was really interesting. I guess we need to let Matt introduce himself real quick so we can get to our guest. Matt.
Yep, I'm Matt. I help out with Ricky on the UNCC weather page. Fire safety engineering student at Charlotte, but been a lifelong weather geek, so that's kind of why I'm here.
And he's leading the weather challenge right now at school. The only meteorology or non-meteorology major in our contest is leading. So go figure.
All right. Well, thanks, Matt. And it's been a couple of weeks since Matt's been on, so we're glad to have him back. I know school has been busy, so we're glad that you're back with us tonight. I think we have a record number of guests tonight, 4 guests, talking about the Carolina Wedge, and we represent North Carolina.
Hold on. I don't think Chris counts as a guest anymore. He's officially one of us at this point.
That's true. We'll introduce him. We've got you in the title, so we'll let you be a guest tonight, but you are just kind of one of us. We got the state of North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Georgia, all represented tonight. So we got the whole entire side.
Maybe we need to change the name of the group now.
Maybe. So 3 of our guests have been on the program, so I'm going to let our first guest, Rich Rogers, who is a newbie to the program tonight, to kind of introduce himself first. He is the meteorologist at WAGT NBC 26 in Augusta, Georgia, where I hope he can hook me up with some master tickets one day. Yeah, but anyway, Rich, thank you so much for coming on tonight, and I'll kind of let you introduce yourself and what your path has been in weather like so far.
Well, I appreciate that, Scotty. The closest I can get to the Masters is probably above my head here. This painting here of the clubhouse here. So, yeah, it's hard. It's hard for even us to get in there. But I'm a meteorologist at NBC 26. I do weekend evenings, and I call it the weekend and whenever schedule because you never know. But yeah, I've been at WAGT for about 8 years now, and I'm from Augusta, so that's why I've been there so long, and really enjoy weather. I've always had a passion for weather, even when I was a kid, and I just kind of stuck with it and have been there ever since, and just enjoy telling the local people what to expect. Hopefully, what to expect. You know, had a little upset this past weekend with the weather forecast, but most of the time we do pretty good, and so we're just, I'm glad to be here and appreciate y'all inviting me on.
Yeah, no problem. The last time we tried to have Rich on, he had some connection issues, so we're glad to get those bugs worked out. We're glad that you were able to join us. And tell us about this past weekend, Rich. I mean, besides Chris's area, you guys really saw some snow down there in the Midlands of South Carolina.
Yeah, I woke up, I have these text alerts that come from the Weather Service on my phone, and I actually woke up to a text message, and it said winter weather advisory, and I about fell out of the bed. And it wasn't just for, you know, an isolated county out in the boondocks somewhere. It was for our metro area and many of the other counties out there. And so that really surprised me. So of course I jumped out of bed to see what was going on. And in Augusta, which is where we're based, Augusta, Georgia, there was just rain, a cold rain, but we heard reports of flakes mixing in around Aiken, South Carolina, and then we started getting pictures of accumulation not that far away. People were saying, about 10 miles outside of North Augusta, 10 to 15 miles in that range, they were getting some accumulation of snow, and the soil temperatures have been in the 60s, and we had record highs or near record highs for several days leading up to this. So it was quite surprising that the snow would even be able to stick. And so that tells you kind of how fast it was coming down, that it just was not having enough time to melt before it would accumulate. And but the main snowfall occurred parts of Edgefield County. We had a storm spotter who lives in Edgefield County, which is just sort of northeast of Augusta, and he was a little closer to the Saluda County line, but he had about three quarters of an inch of snow on the ground there. And then, of course, we heard about the 4 to near 5-inch amounts in Lexington County, which is just outside our DMA, and a portion of I-20 was closed temporarily in both directions because of this freak snow event. So very interesting for November 1st. I still don't believe it. Can y'all confirm that it really did happen? Because I don't believe it, and we certainly, that was one of the reasons we didn't forecast it, because it was November 1st. So
I was going to say, that perfectly sums it up. Freak snowstorm, November 1st, Midlands of South Carolina. It just doesn't make sense, but
it doesn't. No.
Sometimes the weather gods are, they just kind of like to just laugh at us and throw us little teases. So, yeah, very unique system. And to talk about the other side of that system, up in the mountains of Tennessee and Virginia, is Chris Michaels, who is meteorologist at WCYB for the Tri-Cities area in Tennessee. Chris, thanks for coming on tonight, and tell us a little bit about you and what you saw this weekend.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again. I'm Chris Michaels, a meteorologist with WCYB. Got into weather kind of freakishly. I met Greg Fischel, who's the chief meteorologist at WRAL. Met him my senior year of high school, and then was mistakenly placed into an introduction to meteorology course. So I went from wanting to be a music producer to being an on-air meteorologist within 4 years. So that's how I got into the field. And as far as this past weekend, it was really cool. It was my first time dealing with winter weather as a non-student, so it was a lot of fun. The elevation really played into it. Of course, with northwest flow, we had one area of higher elevation on the southwest Virginia and southeast Kentucky border, which is prone to higher amounts with that kind of wind direction. And then, obviously, the Appalachian Mountains. So we had some areas that were anywhere from 8 to 11 inches, and then obviously Mount LeConte in the Smoky Mountains, which is out of our viewing area, had 22 inches. But then here in Kingsport, Tennessee, where I live, there was nothing. I'm going to share a picture with you guys that I thought was really cool from one of our viewers, and you can just kind of see. Can you guys see that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so you can just kind of see this nice fine dividing line between where it was snowing and where it was not. And what really kind of made me scratch my head was in Kingsport, the air temperature was 33, and you had snow aloft. So I thought that once it would fall into the above freezing air, the melting of the snow would eventually cool the air towards below freezing, to where you would eventually see snow, and it just didn't happen in Kingsport, also because it's our lowest elevation within our viewing area. So pretty cool event, really impressive from a dynamic standpoint, and I guess I'll say I can't wait to do it again, but I keep being told by people that I should bite my tongue.
Yeah, most definitely. It was a little tease of what I'm afraid maybe what our winter's going to have in store for us. And to kind of talk about the North Carolina Piedmont and the southern part of Virginia and a guy who's really cool who let me come hang out with him for a couple hours last couple weeks ago. My friend Grant Gilmore. Grant from WFMY Greensboro. How are you doing tonight, my friend?
Doing well. A lot calmer weather, at least for now, before things start to get interesting again. But yeah, talking about last weekend, it was one of those situations where we were pretty sure that we weren't going to see any snow of any type, at least in the immediate Piedmont. But, there was that possibility that the air was cold enough aloft where we could have gotten some of those snowflakes kind of being pulled down to the surface before they melted. But, going into 24 hours before we actually were starting to see some of that noticeable weather move in, the model started to shift, suggesting that cold pocket, the low really kind of digging down to the south over South Carolina. And, that was an interesting thing to see because then you had a lot of that majority of the colder air south. So we were wondering, was that actually going to verify, or were we going to get stuck somewhere in the middle where maybe some of that colder air was a little more to the north? So it was still up in the air. We thought we knew what was going to happen, so we kept a chance of some snowflakes into the first half of the day. And I mean, maybe it was just, my eyes playing tricks on me, but I swear, and, some of our other meteorologists kind of swear the same thing, that there were some very, very, very wet and almost completely melted snowflakes, in the Triad. But, that could have just been kind of a deception because it was just kind of a nasty day here in the Triad. No real reports of anything aside from just wet, cold rain through the day, though we did have a lot of wind later in the day, going through the evening, probably through around like 9 or 10 o'clock or so. The winds really started to pick up, and actually had a couple of trees fall down. I don't think anything else aside from just some dead trees that were just waiting for a little gust of wind to push them over. But aside from that, it was just a cold, rainy day. But if, the low would have developed a little bit differently, that trough wouldn't have dug so far south, we could have had some snow here in the Tri. But it was interesting to see how that cold air literally just detoured around us, and we didn't get any of that snow that dropped through South Carolina and even to parts of Georgia. Going into the 11 o'clock news Friday night, I was looking at the radar and looked at one time there was snow, at least by the radar signature, all the way from Illinois through Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, Tennessee, and even into Alabama and Georgia and South Carolina, in fact. And then here in the Tri, we were just looking at a cold rain moving in. So it's an interesting event, especially considering that it was, at that time, not even November. So here we go, right? Winter is upon us.
Yes, it is. And our final guest tonight, Brad Panovich from WCNC NBC Charlotte, and the only man in the Charlotte market who says, hey, we need to watch while these models are picking up on a little bit of the snow streak in the upstate of South Carolina. Brad was one of the guys who said we need to pay attention to that. So, Brad, welcome to the show tonight. You've been with us several times. I know everybody knows you, but I'll kind of let you do your little intro as well and kind of talk about the past weekend.
Yeah, for those who don't know me, I'm the chief meteorologist here at NBC Charlotte in the beautiful Queen City of the South. Been here, believe it or not, it's hard to imagine, but December will be my 12th year at this station. So it's been quite an amazing, and I remember it so well because you guys probably remember this, the ice storm of 2002 was my first week in Charlotte. I wasn't on the air yet, but I will never forget moving up here in the midst of that ice storm. I think we ended up with like 1.5 inches of ice in early December. And when you have 1 inch of ice in early December, there's still leaves on the trees in the Piedmont of the Carolinas. So that was quite a week without power for many people. This last weekend, it's interesting you say that, Scotty, because I did say that, but in the back of my mind, I was like, there's no way that's happening. But it was funny, the RPM model, which is kind of a modified WRF-NAM 4 model that we use here at the station, and a lot of stations use from WSI, really did the last 2 or 3 runs Friday. We're really hinting hard at that Piedmont and Midlands of South Carolina snow. I was really kind of surprised how well it verified. But it goes to show you, if you can get that bowling ball 500 millibar low to move down here, you can get right underneath that. You can get snow like that, and that was just amazing to see. It snowed 3 or 4 inches an hour and a half to the south of Charlotte, and basically nothing here. That was really interesting. Chris showed a great shot. We got a very similar shot from a viewer, or actually one of our spotters. I'm going to try to share it because I love these shots, and if you get really geeked out by stuff like this, this is really cool. This is a very similar image. You could see the, this is in northern Cleveland County. I can't remember, this is something Knob. It's one of the mountains in South Mountain State Park. But the top of this ridge, I think, is 3,200 feet or so. And so you can see it's almost exactly halfway up the rain-snow line, which is about 1,500 to 1,700 feet. So it's kind of nice. You don't need a dual Doppler radar or a weather balloon or a sounding. When you get pictures like this, you can kind of do the math for yourself. The other cool thing was we just installed a new camera on the top of the View apartment complex in Charlotte. It's a big building on the west side of Charlotte. Yeah, it sticks out pretty big. It's 600 feet tall, and our camera on the top at times Saturday morning was picking up snowflakes at the top of the building, but nothing down at the ground level, which is always really cool to see. And there's a lot of high-rise condos in Charlotte. If you haven't been in Uptown, it's kind of a very, very metropolitan city. There are a lot of people that live in high floors in these buildings, and you get pictures from people's balconies of ice and snow, and it's not snowing down at the ground level, at the street level. So it's kind of cool to see that actually kind of unfold. But I honestly was a little surprised the amount of snow that fell in South Carolina. Like Grant, we had some wet snowflakes in there, because certainly a system that dynamic, it's not out of the question for that to happen. And the mountain forecast worked out really well, and boy, would I would have given to be on Mount LeComte this past weekend. And been up in that lodge to see that. One of these days I'm going to be in that lodge for one of these big snows, because to me that is one of the coolest locations in the southeast, and I just want to be there for one of these big storms.
Yeah, 22 inches of the picture of the guy standing out there with it up to his waist is crazy. So a very complex weather system, and guess what? It had nothing to do with the Carolina Wedge. What we're talking about tonight. Oddly enough. And with that, that's my little transition to Ricky, as he will take over the rest of the show tonight.
All right. Thank you very much, Scotty. As he mentioned, our topic tonight is the dreaded, awful, or fantastic, depending on your point of view, if you like cloudy and cool weather, Carolina Wedge. Let's toss it to one of our panel members first. Let's go with Grant to have him explain a little bit about what the Carolina Wedge is, because usually you're smack dab in the middle of it whenever it comes down into our region.
Well, I mean, basically what it is I mean, there's so many different ways that this Carolina Wedge can set up, and there's so many different ways it can give you a headache when you're trying to forecast it, which is, why we really do have a lot of problems forecasting with it. But what it is when you get basically an area of high pressure that's anywhere between South Dakota and the New England states. So basically kind of evolving out of, Canada, dropping down, and basically situating itself to our north. So with high pressure, you're going to have that clockwise circulation around the center of that high. So what ends up happening is, so you get this cold air source coming in out of Canada, and you have an easterly flow up over the New England states, and it literally is banking up against the Appalachian Mountains. And then the fact that cold air is dense, it's going to basically stay lower in elevation. So it's forced to the south by the mountains, almost like a cow herder, if you would. So it's forced in the direction that the mountains are pointing, so eventually that points it down to the south into the Triad. So sometimes that's not that big of a deal. Sometimes we just get stuck with cold air here in the Piedmont. But in the wedge scenario is when you get that cold air pushing down to the south, and then you have a low pressure system that can develop anywhere from the Gulf of Mexico to even somewhere off of the Atlantic. And that low pressure system with its warm and moist air will then push that warm and moist air and ultimately precipitation over that colder air that is being wedged underneath. So you have this warm and moist precipitation that is ultimately falling into a layer of cold air at the surface. And just depending on how that cold air source from the north, that high pressure system, how that interacts with that low pressure system is kind of determining what type of weather that you see. So it really is a lot of different factors that come together to give you this really interesting temperature profile that is, gives us the 4 types of precipitation here in the Triad, and sometimes you can get every single type of precipitation all in one event. So that really does make it for a complicated but exciting forecast. And we see that a lot. In fact, this past summer we saw a surprising number of these cold air damming or wedge events where we had this area of high pressure pushing down the cold air on the eastern side of the mountains, and we were left with unusually cool temperatures here in the Triad. So that's kind of the basics of it, but it really does play a big part in winter forecasting.
And Chris, you're up in the mountains. Talk a little bit about how the wedge impacts or more likely doesn't impact you up there, and the impact the mountains have on the wedge, mainly the reason it exists.
Right, yeah, and it was so cool because my senior year, I had a professor, Dr. Gary Lackman, and he went into such heavy detail about cold air damming, and then I found out that I was getting a job on the other side of that event, and I went up to him, I said, so everything you taught me is a lie, right? But not necessarily. So with the mountains, one thing that I wish I could find data for is the Freud number, the Freud number. It has something to do with zonal flow and how the stronger the zonal flow is, the more the wedge will leak over to our side of the mountains. Because what will usually happen is that we'll get easterlies or southeasterlies, and we'll get compressional warming on our side. So it'll generally be a mostly sunny day, a little bit warmer, and then you'll have a 20-degree spread within 30 miles or something. So what we'll typically see because of the mountains is that Marion, Virginia, so Smith and Grayson counties in Virginia will generally be 20 to 25 degrees colder than the adjacent counties to the west. So we kind of have to forecast both ends of it, the fair weather side and then the actual side that's getting the wedge. We have seen the wedge leak over a little bit from stronger wind speeds, but over the past 6 months I've been here, we've seen so many events that's kind of hard to remember. Another thing that I thought was pretty cool, through reading Dr. Lackman's book, which I believe is just called Mid-Latitude Synoptic Meteorology, which I think you guys should all get. It's just a fun book to read, and you'll learn a lot from it, is that there have been models, experimental models that have been made of a classical cold air damming event with and without the mountains. And you'll see that the difference is just, it's amazing to see how much of a difference there is. I don't have the picture with me. The book is actually in my car, but really cool to see how the mountains will play into that. And Ricky, it looked like you were going through a book there, so I don't know if you've got something to show. There it is. That's my Bible senior year.
Same book we use in all our synoptic classes.
Yeah, no, it's a phenomenal book. He would assign readings to us, and it was the first time that I didn't want to pull my hair out when I was assigned to textbook readings. It was just so much fun to read. But yeah, I would look through, I think it's chapter 8, the cold air damming chapter, and look for that simulation. It's really, really cool.
I can pull up the dynamics book if you like, if you want to talk about pulling your hair out, but we won't go that far tonight. Rich, comment a little bit on usually how far south the wedge gets, because you are in that area to where sometimes it gets down to your region, sometimes it stays a little bit north. You're kind of on that boundary region. Talk about how you forecast that and the factors that go into how far south it ends up.
Well, it is tricky, and we're kind of, if you're looking at a map of Georgia, we're kind of on the eastern side, midway between Savannah and the mountains, and so, but our DMA goes to not far from Savannah and not terribly far from the mountains. So there's a wide range sometimes when these things develop, and we can have one side of the area kind of like Chris was saying, 20 degrees warmer than the other side, from north to south, and it's usually from northeast to southwest kind of orientation with the temperature profile. But I've seen these wedges cause cooler temperatures in southwest Georgia well outside of our DMA, so sometimes they can go pretty far to the south, but it just depends on how strong it is. It depends on how strong the high pressure system is and where it's located. If it's located over New England as opposed to over the Atlantic, and things like that we take into consideration. And we really pay close attention when we're forecasting, and this makes sense, but it's worth mentioning to what's happening in the Piedmont and coastal plains of Virginia and North Carolina. and to watch the trends to see if it's still progressing our way. And an example I remember, my memory's not too good the older I get of recent events, but I can sometimes remember events from a long time ago better. And one that comes to mind is a 2004 ice storm, which impacted a lot of South Carolina and here in Georgia. We were a little caught off guard by that too, because the wedge was stronger than what was forecast, and we kept watching the cold air it was just pushing down into South Carolina, the Midlands of South Carolina, and it came our way, and we ended up having a pretty sizable ice storm about 10 years ago in the Augusta area because of the wedge being stronger than was forecast. So we keep a close eye on it. And another annoying thing about the wedge is how long it takes to dissipate, and that's very tricky as well, because we'll think, oh, it's going to be warming up, we're finally getting rid of this, we'll get some sunshine, and it doesn't happen till the next day. And so it can be very tricky timing when how far south it gets, when it gets that far south, and when it dissipates.
And Brad, as Rich kind of alluded to, forecasting the wedge seems to be the trickiest thing around here. We kind of have a rule in our forecasting class, always put it 24 hours longer than whatever the models say. You've been here 12 years. What's your experience with it?
Sometimes it depends on the time of year. I've seen it go 2-3 days longer than you anticipate. It's all about that sun angle. And I think Rich brings up a good point. There's a lot of challenging things about the CAD. The first and foremost is just forecasting its development. Typically, the models will hint at it, and if you're not from this area or don't forecast in this area, you will underestimate the CAD the first time you see it hinted at in the GFS or the long-range modeling. It's just something you learn. I used to call it the GFS CAD. It doesn't look like much. The temperatures are never right, but if you see the position of the high and the low, as Grant talked about, then you kind of know what to expect. In the heart of the winter, when the sun angle is really low, it is incredibly difficult to scour out the wedge, especially if you have any moisture or precipitation in it, unless you get a really strong southwest flow or some kind of front. Now, in the warm season, you can scour it out just by the heating of the day. It will get eroded by the edges. But as Rich talked about, sometimes those warm season wedge events like we had this summer or in late spring or early fall are the most difficult, because if you bust, you're not busting by a couple degrees. You could bust by 20 or 25 degrees. So the bust there is huge. In the wintertime, usually your issue with the wedge is precipitation type, or what we call P-type, and you're always worried about the thickness. And if you ever want to become a meteorologist, try to forecast the cold air damming event in the winter, and then see if you can make it through it, because it is both excruciatingly difficult to deal with, but also utterly fascinating as a scientist. That literally the difference between 1,000 feet of cold air can be all the difference between a mega ice storm or a freezing cold rain or a nice fluffy white snow. I mean, it's just amazing, the small little nuances. And to the general public, we all think about what's going down on the ground, but really, when you're talking about the CAD, that we call cold air damming for short, it's all about what's going on above our heads. So those soundings are really crucial to forecasting in the winter. And then there's my always favorite springtime cold air damming events, severe weather on the edge of the cold air damming event. I don't know how many times I've seen supercells in April or even late March form on the CAD boundary down in South Carolina, because you have incredibly localized helicity values where you have a northeast wind and a dew point of like 15, and on the other side of the wedge it's like 80 degrees with a dew point of like 60. I mean, and with a south wind. So just all these nuances of the cold air wedging is just amazing. And it's pretty cool that this is one of only 2 places in the whole country that we get this type of setup. One is on the Front Range of the Rockies, east of Denver, and then here in the Carolinas. So it is really an amazing thing to forecast. And I really, as much as I cringe and I curse at it, I really do enjoy it as a meteorologist, the challenge.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you guys just a quick question. For the TV Mets, as we have our own pages like Facebook, we have a couple of counties we cover. But as you guys, I know for Brad, just because I'm in his media market, but Grant, this goes out to you and Chris and Rich as well. You know, I see when we have one of these, Brad shows north of Lake Norman could be getting an ice storm, south of Lake Norman could be getting flooded. You know, it's just a very dividing line. How hard is that for you guys forecasting to relay to the public, hey, it takes literally 2 miles and you can see one thing or the other?
It's hard. Just in Mecklenburg County a couple times, Scotty, it's been the northern part of the counties had ice and the southern part of the counties had rain. I've even driven from my house, which is in South Charlotte, and only 10 minutes to the station at the airport, and I've driven from rain into ice. It's just amazing how small it is. And our market is really unique. For people that don't live in the Charlotte area, I cover all the way up to Chris's market over there in Tennessee. I go up to Ashe County, which is on the Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina border. And I go down to Avery County. So I have 3 mountain counties that have elevations up to 6,400 feet. And then I go almost all the way down to Columbia, South Carolina, and halfway to Fayetteville. So the elevation change is about 6,400 feet down to just a couple hundred feet. And in the summertime, it's hard enough, but in the wintertime, like you said, you could have an ice storm warning, a winter storm warning, flash flood warnings, even severe weather, all within the 22 counties that we cover.
You know, in terms of what we deal with here in the Piedmont, you know, it's in the Triad area in central North Carolina. If you're not familiar, like Greensboro is basically, you know, halfway in between Raleigh and like your Hickory area. So, I mean, we cover a huge amount of area in terms of not just, you know, spatially, but also in terms of topographically and different elevation change. We go all the way up to, it's actually weird how Brad's market from Charlotte kind of curls up on the western side of our viewing area, where he's almost going up to Boone, and we're up to Wilkes County and Wilkesboro and everything. And the most recent time that we've dealt with this cold air damming and where it turned out to be a big snowstorm was back actually this year in February for the February 12th and 13th storm. And the way we have to break it down, you can't just put up one map that shows, okay, here's what's going to happen. Here's your 2 to 3 inches of snow, here's your 4 to 6, and here's your 7 to 9. You really do have to break it down and say, okay, Piedmont, from Forsyth County to Alamance County or whatever those counties are, this is what you have, this is your timeline, and this is how we think it's all going to come together. And then you have to say, okay, Piedmont, you guys are out of this talk now. Foothills, here's what you have. And it's a completely different forecast approach. You have to look at elevation. You have to look at, you know, the precipitation type and how long that's going to be a factor. And it really does take a lot of time. And, you know, from a newscast standpoint, you know, I have to sit there and walk over to the producer and say, look, this isn't, you know, a normal, you know, weather forecast here. We really have to break down who's going to see what and when that's going to happen. And sometimes it does take a lot longer, and that's where, you know, social media has really been a saving grace, because, you know, whether we like it or not, we still only have about 3 minutes to give that forecast. So we can go to Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or whatever it is, and really break it down, and of course our websites to really give that detailed description, because it's not as easy as, you know, one graphic of painting, you know, the different snowfall amounts.
And Rich, we go back to winter weather, and you guys had a pretty big ice event. I forget if it was last year or the year before that down in your region. Actually took down some of the famous trees at the Augusta golf course, correct?
Yeah, that was actually this past winter, and Grant just referred to that same time frame. It was February 12th, and had some massive widespread power outages. And I mentioned earlier the 2004 ice storm, which, you know, in my mind was sort of like, that's the bad one, but this year was worse than that one. And we had, you're right, the famous tree at Augusta National that was named after President Eisenhower was basically destroyed because of the ice storm. They had to cut the rest of it down because it wasn't going to survive. And so that was kind of a landmark there that we were sorry to lose. But yeah, I was going to mention about the timing thing as a broadcast meteorologist. When you're dealing with these situations, the hardest part is trying to fit all this information into about 3 minutes, and it's nearly impossible. And we're kind of fortunate. We do get about a 3-minute weather segment, and then a little later in the newscast we'll get about another minute and a half. So sometimes we can kind of say, come back and we'll detail this a little bit more. But it's still difficult, and it's just not easy to explain. I've actually done a story on just cold air damming when we had it not too long ago. I can't remember exactly when it was I did this story, but I made a graphic to explain it, because you can't explain it all during a normal weather cast. So this was something that ran in addition to the weather segment that particular evening. But it does take a while to explain it to people and to explain the impacts to people, especially when various parts of your DMA are experiencing far different impacts from from another area.
And Chris, relaying to you wedge-wise, I don't live far from you. I think we're like 60 nautical miles away from each other, and you and I joke all the time where it's like 54 cloudy and foggy here, and you're like basking in the sun, 75 degrees on a sunny day. So, and just kind of talking about the difference of not many, it doesn't take much miles from me to you, and we see two totally different things in the weather.
Yeah, and I think I should note that, I obviously don't have the experience that Brad, Rich, or Grant have, so I can't relate to an ice storm or supercell tornadoes. All I have right now is that big temperature difference. But you just said it, there's some days when I'm, we have these graphics that you put up a picture of a city and then a box that says 75 is a high, and you just cannot do that during one of these setups. So I always make sure to post our local temperature map and really dive into the forecast to make sure that every spot is accounted for. Because if I were to say 75 and mostly sunny, I'd be getting phone calls from people in Marion, Virginia, asking me where I got my degree from, and rightfully so. So, it's just one of those things that I've only seen it from a temperature standpoint, but then, as Grant was saying, it's really a blessing to have social media in this case, because we'll have a sky camera set up in Boone, and then we'll have a sky camera set up in Kingsport, Tennessee, and I've done it multiple times where the wedge has come in, and I grab one picture from each, and I post it to social, and number one, it blows up, it's good web traffic, but number two, it allows me to explain what I couldn't do in an extra 15 to 30 seconds of, okay, so high pressure is here doing this, and then one area is seeing this, meanwhile another area just a few miles away is seeing this. So all I've really seen so far has been the cloud cover difference, the temperature difference, but I'm sure at some point I'm going to get to get my hands dirty in something more than just that.
And talking about boundaries, Brad and Grant, you guys have had some interesting tornado setups over the years, and the potential for severe weather along these wedge boundaries. Talk a little bit, maybe reminisce on a past event, and talk about how the boundaries kind of help increase felicity and some of the parameters along them whenever storms form.
Well, at least for me here in the Triad, it's interesting when you get a CAT event, cold air damming event. Usually it's strong enough to where usually that boundary pushes south. So usually it's down around Brad's area, and I think you guys see a lot more of that. The boundaries of that lining up. And I can remember time and time where I've sat here going into my newscast, and I've got a graphic made that says, we're in the cool and stable layer. Yeah, it's kind of cloudy out there, but the air is stable. We've got temperatures in the 50s, and it's not that big of a deal. But you drive south about 60 miles or something like that, and you've got tornado warnings and you've got severe thunderstorm warnings lighting up like crazy. And, Brad's having to go wall to wall. Meanwhile, it's just a normal day here in the Triad. So, that happens a lot where you have this northeasterly flow pushing that cool, stable air down to the south, and then just 60 miles south in Brad's area, you've got a warm, moist flow, and you've got air coming from a completely different direction, ramping up over that, and there's your spin in the air. You've got some sort of lift right along that boundary. You've got a little bit of humidity, and got that heat to help lift that air parcel up, and you've got a lot of spin going on to produce those tornadoes. So, fortunately for us here in the Triad, that boundary in situations where you might get severe weather is typically south of us.
I have to say, I've got an image of Grant sitting back in his chair drinking his coffee while Brad's on air there, pulling out his hair from tornado warnings. But Brad, talk about some of the previous warnings we've had in our area. Scotty always remembers the Burke County tornado. We had the Reedy Creek storm. Both of those were along the wedge boundary, were they not?
Yeah, the one that sticks out to me is obviously the Reedy Creek one. That was kind of an interesting night. We were, like Grant said, we were well into this stable air mass. I think the temperature might have been in the 40s to maybe near 50 degrees. This was in March. I'm looking at my blog from that day. This was March 3rd, I believe, 2012. And we had strong storms down in the warm sector south of the boundary, and they were traveling north. And a pretty strong little cell came up and interacted with the wedge boundary that was right across Mecklenburg County. And when these storms interacted with that wedge boundary, it spun up a quick tornado, which was missed by GSP. There was no warning for it. Raleigh actually put a warning out for Stanley County, one county away, because you really couldn't see it from the Greenville-Spartanburg 88D Doppler radar. You had to look at the terminal Doppler data. And we had an EF2 tornado touch down and destroyed several homes in Mecklenburg and Cabarrus County. Actually tossed two young boys out onto 485. So it was an incredible storm, and this happened at 2:30 in the morning on top of all this. So it was just an amazing storm system to kind of track, and really social media saved our butt that night, because as much as I was analyzing the radar, if I didn't get reports from the university area, people's power going out and cable service going out, I knew there was some kind of damage occurring. Didn't necessarily think it was a tornado at first. I knew there was straight line winds, and one volume scale later, sure enough, there it is. That thing spun up and was probably there for about 5-6 minutes and then gone. So it just it's one of those events I will always remember, because I stayed up late that night and we got on the air right away and flew the helicopter the next morning to see the damage that was caused. All of this at a night when at the station the temperature maybe barely got into the low 50s, and it rained, and it was just a cool kind of misty, drizzly day. And to think you could get severe weather out of that is just amazing. But along that boundary, you can really get some enhanced, what we call helicity. It's basically wind shear, and it produces its own, and it doesn't take a lot to get these little tornadoes to spin up even in the middle of the night.
Yeah, and Joey, I'll bring you in on this one because this was a little closer to us. We were watching that back in 2012, and actually the wedge had actually pushed through our area, was kind of set up for the upstate, and it was being pushed back along the wedge. The warm air was being pushed back up into our area when we saw the tornado develop there in Rutherford and then Burke counties and then into the Catawba County line. So it's produced a lot of severe weather down in our area. When we see the wedge set up and we see the chance of thunderstorms, that really keys our attention here in the many tornadoes over here in the western part of North Carolina.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we always watch out for. Anytime you get those stronger storms moving up from the southwest, and we know we got that boundary here, it always seems like a lot of times they'll get going, and when they get right to that boundary, it's like they'll anchor on it and they'll produce, they'll start to spin more and actually get, that's when they usually produce their tornadoes or our more severe weather.
And Daniel, I think you had a comment.
Yeah, I'll tell you an experience I personally dealt with before. Back in December of '98, I went down and visited some family members in Lee County, which is the Sanford area, which is the Raleigh TV market. And sometimes when you go down east, you run into a problem where you have a coastal front, and it'll kind of, have a battle between the coastal front and the wedge. And I remember in Lee County, the wedge got down into the Sanford area, and it's like 33 degrees. And I remember watching the local TV down there, winter weather advisory, the chance of some freezing precip. Well, then as soon as they was running one of the crawls on the screen, Then I saw a crawl for a tornado watch for the same county, and it was for Lee County. What happened to Lee County in 1 hour's period is it went from 33 degrees to 63 degrees, all because of a frontal trough that got pushed from the coastline, and it just scoured the wedge out. And granted, I've never lived down east, and I don't know how all that works on a regular basis, but that was one of the more significant events that I can remember that I personally witnessed. We went from kind of a marginal ice accretion on trees to like 60s in a matter of 1 hour. It was amazing.
And that leads us into our viewer question. This Andrew actually asked us what was the most extreme cold air damming event any of our panel members have seen. He said he once experienced freezing rain at 16 degrees Fahrenheit in a cold air damming event. So any of you want to take that or throw in some of your personal stories?
Well,
like 16.
Hey, I think the one Brad mentioned when he first came on here, 2002, when he first got here, that was, at the time, some people kind of called that the super CAD because it wasn't forecasted well, and it just got worse and worse. And I remember that CAD went, well down into Georgia, and it might even touch, like, northeast Alabama. That's how strong it was. But that 2002 event, to me, might have been one of the worst.
There's the map. Let me blow it up a little bit more. That was the setup for that event. And that Arctic high ended up being about 1042 millibars centered pretty much over northern Virginia and southern PA. And I think the dew points were in the single digits. And the QPF, I still remember this because single digit and the QPF amounts liquid were like 2.5, 2 3/4 inches. And it was just amazing. And from a QPF standpoint, that's the most I've ever seen. I mean, I'm not talking like a tenth of an inch of ice. There was like 1.5 inches to 2 inches of ice. It was pouring rain and like 25 degrees outside in Charlotte. I'm not talking like drizzle. I'm talking like thunderstorm downpour. And the interesting thing about that event, it happened so early in the season, the ground was actually really warm, so all the ice was up in the trees and on the power lines. And the roads were absolutely fine. There was actually no ice at all on the roads because the ground was so warm and the water coming down was cold, but it wasn't able to freeze on the ground. It froze to all the trees and power lines. So you didn't have slippery roads. Your biggest issue was getting around was the trees and the power lines blocking the roadways. And this isn't a CAT event, but another interesting freezing rain event I saw in Michigan. And just we're talking about precipitation type freezing rain. I actually saw freezing. I don't even call it freezing rain, but freezing rain with the temperature above 32 degrees. And you're probably saying, Brad, how does that happen? The ground was so cold that the ground was frozen, and the air temperature was actually in the mid to upper 30s, but the rain was freezing on the ground surface because the ground had frozen to like 2 feet of depth. And we saw the ice on the roads build up, even though the air temperature was above freezing. It's the first time in my career, and still till I can remember this day, that we got ice on the roads when the temperature was above 32 degrees. That's one of my pet peeves. I always yell at people, you can't have freezing rain unless it's below freezing. That was an instance where we actually had ice on the roads and the temperature was above freezing.
Go ahead, Daniel.
I'm sorry. Sorry to interrupt you guys. I'll tell you another one that was really bad, and I remember this. I was in middle school. February 1994, we had a devastating ice storm that basically stretched along I-40 from the mountains all the way to about Raleigh. QPF totals very comparable to the 2002 event we've just talked about. But I remember watching Eric Thomas at Channel 3 in Charlotte, who, of course, has been on our show before. I remember he was talking about the temperature profile during that 94 event. It was like 28 degrees at the surface, but at 5,000 feet, it was like 50 degrees. So it just, the result of it was an absolutely devastating ice storm. That was in February, maybe like February 1st of 94.
Yeah, this past winter was actually, I've been here in Greensboro for, I guess, since 2009. So, going on 5 years now, or a little bit more than that, 6 now. This past past February was the biggest cold air damming / snowstorm event that we've had since I've been here, and in fact it stretches, I think, snowfall wise back into that 2001-2002 winter as the most snowfall that we've seen since then. And we did live coverage through the entire thing, and I actually was able to find the SKU from, I'll pull that up in a second, but it was interesting. We started the day, or the event, I guess I should say, sometime around 2 or 3 o'clock when we started to see the snowfall. Temperatures were at 22 degrees at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I mean we were just locked in, cold air from the ground up to about probably about like 35,000 feet, and all of that below freezing. And then as the event went on, as we went later and later into the evening, that warm nose started coming in, and we're looking at it. We were thinking a night full of snow, but the warm nose came in stronger. It was still 22 degrees at the surface, and it starts to sleet, and then by the time we got to our 11 o'clock news, it was rain on top of about 6 inches of snow on the ground. It's raining, and we still have temperatures in the mid-20s at 11 o'clock at night. So now you've got the snow on the trees, on the roads, on everything, and then now you've got a nice cold rain falling down, and everything is freezing over. I'm gonna try to share this real quick here because just an amazing map here. Hold on one second. So if you can see this, can you guys see that? Is that pulled up there?
Yeah.
Okay, so we had like 9 inches of snow in Greensboro, but just compare that with the ice that came in. A 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch of ice fell on top of all of that snow, and here's the SKU. It started off, early that morning, 12Z. We're pretty cold actually. Let's go back a little bit. This is actually that morning of, all below freezing, and then you can see how that warm nose starts coming in, and we're still so cold at the surface, and it wouldn't erode. That cold air damming just totally locked in, and it was a nasty event. One that definitely turned out to be a storm of the century, it seems like.
And Joey, you and I, we were talking about that, where our Burke Weather office is in Valdez, and you there in Hickory, good 15 minutes away. We were seeing solid snow, and you were seeing a sleet and freezing rainstorm. I remember that storm in detail last year.
Yeah, at some points we were just complete rain, and you guys were getting all snow. So I've seen it that bad just up the road from here, to be honest with you. Go from rain here to snow in Hickory, because I'm actually in Newton. Go from Newton having rain and Hickory having snow. So
yeah, and I guess we're coming up on the 9 o'clock hour. I guess a little novelty question I have for all our Mets, TV Mets, is what's been the most memorable cold air wedge situation that you forecasted or you've experienced in your career so far?
Most memorable, man. There was so many early on. And the funny thing is, up until this year, the one that Grant mentioned, which thankfully we had a lot of snow, but we had ice on top. We have not had a lot lately, and it makes me really wonder. We are so overdue for an ice storm that I really cringe to think if we get into a pattern where we get a whole bunch. But I think back to the 2002 storm. I think back to 2004, 2005. I think back to this year, but the 2002 one is going to stick out to me for a long time. Not only because I just got to the Carolinas, but also the storm that it was compared to was a hurricane, Hugo, because up until this ice storm in 2002, Hugo had been responsible for the biggest power outage, at least in Duke's power grid in western North Carolina, and for the most tree damage in the Charlotte area. And then the 2002 ice storm actually surpassed it. So that will always stick out to me, just because from a tree and power line damage standpoint, those two storms in the Charlotte area were the biggest by far.
And Grant, before you say anything, I pulled up a sounding gear. This is from the 2003 ice storm. Our buddy Andrew sent it to us. This was the event he was referring to, talking about the really, really cold temperatures down towards like -15, getting freezing rain.
That's wild. That's wild.
You know the thing about that, Ricky, that's fascinating from a weather standpoint? is you see that sounding and you think, oh, freezing rain. But you got to be careful. In some sense, in situations like that, sometimes it's so warm aloft that warm air can overtake the surface layer. And I've seen this happen a couple times. Now, it hasn't been minus 15, but where it's 50 degrees a couple thousand feet off the ground, and that warm water comes down and actually warms up the surface layer. So if you don't have dynamic cooling going on to sustain it, or what we call a parent high to continue to pump in cold, dry air, the warm air aloft can actually overtake, and the opposite of what happened last weekend, where you had dynamic cooling and the snow brought the cold air to the surface. In this case, the warm air will be brought down to the surface by the rain, and I've seen that happen a couple times, especially if you get wet, a heavy warm rain that can actually overpower the surface there. But that's an amazing sounding. Holy cow!
And it's tough though. I mean, and that becomes the problem. What type of precipitation are you going to see? I mean, you look at a sounding, and sure, a forecast sounding shows it looks like it could be freezing rain, but then again, you could see sleet if that air at the surface is so cold. It's going to freeze that rain or whatever it is. I mean, we've educated some of the newsroom now. They know all about grapple. And so you throw that into the mix too, and it just creates a whole issue of precip type. So it's complicated. But Ricky, you're asking about my most memorable cat event, and surprisingly, I have to say it doesn't have anything to do with winter weather or a storm or anything. It was when I was working down in Macon, Georgia, and I went to school at UNC Asheville, and we studied cold air damage because we're right in the mountains. But again, you're kind of on the border of it, where at UNCA we really didn't deal with it that much. We were kind of above it. But when I was down in Macon, Georgia, we had one of those strong cat events come down and set up that stationary boundary right over my viewing area, and it sat there for about 5-7 days. And about halfway through, I'd forecasted for the thing to clear out 2 days ago. And I ended up emailing my professor back up UNCA and saying, hey, do you have any suggestions of what to do in this situation? He goes, nope. And that's what it is, and that's kind of what Brad was alluding to earlier. Look at the models, they'll suggest a clearing out, or they'll suggest that it's developing, and you really just have to sit there and you have to be honest with yourself and the broadcast Mets. You have to be honest with the viewers and say, these cold air damming setups are very complicated to forecast. We're thinking it's going to move out over the next couple of days, but it may not, and you just have to be very honest with them and talk about confidence and really, let them into your world. Otherwise, you're going to be, wearing egg on your face for the next 5 days.
Yeah, Grant, the biggest busts of my career have been cold air damming events, bar none. The worst forecast that I've ever made have been either the CAD held on for one more day or it cleared out quicker than I expected. Because like I said before, you go from sunny and 70 to like rain and 40. I mean, there's no in between in those instances, and it's incredibly frustrating. But as I mentioned, there's so many cool things about it. I mean, I love showing those soundings because, you got parent highs, you've got barrier jets, and, there's like 5 versions of the CAD we didn't even talk about. You got the classic CAD that's diabatically enhanced. See, it's always when I say cold damming, you got to be careful how you spell it too, because sometimes we think of spelling it the other way. Classic dry onset, you got the hybrid, the weak onset, the southern onset, and the in situ, which is, you got this where it's raining and it creates its own wedge. I've seen those a couple times where they'll catch you off guard. There's no parent high, but there's dry air in place, and you get some light rain, and it evaporates and causes a cold pocket up against the mountains, and it creates its own cold air damming. So it's just all these variables. If it was a word problem, it would be like 3 pages long trying to figure out a CAD forecast. It's just unbelievable.
I see what Brad Panovich is doing a presentation on at Weatherfest here in Charlotte coming up in March. Cold air damming.
Yeah, Brad, make sure you have a before you started forecasting cold air damming picture and after, because how much hair did you have when you got here?
It's funny. We're hiring. We're going to hopefully hire a new meteorologist at some point. But the 2 times that we've had new Mets in my office, the first thing I tell them to do, go to the comment modules for cold air damming and go over it like 15 times. Because honestly, if you're not from here or you even went to a good meteorology school, it's so different to be here and have to live through one of these and forecast it than to just study it in a book. Grant is exactly right. Sometimes you just got to eat it and let yourself bust the forecast to figure out what the heck's going on.
That's one comment I would kind of like to make on is it's very unique. You have to be able to go through this situation. A lot of the Mets who nationally may not have into grips as we do with the cold air wedge, they kind of just forecast it as it's just something, but it really is. It does take a toll because it can last a couple of days longer, or else it can erode quicker. I mean, poor Daniel in McDowell County, I think that's the last place in the entire state of North Carolina that the CAD leaves. And it's funny, if you don't have that experience here, I mean, it's really hard to forecast.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I don't think you have a true appreciation for it until you have to forecast it and live through it. It's just, and the cool thing about it, and I think this is great about meteorology in general, is the models are completely useless in some. I mean, you really have to get back to old school forecasting, looking at the surface charts. Sometimes hand drawing the analysis helps big time on where the dry air is, where the boundary is. And just constantly nowcasting. I mean, really get back to the roots of forecasting instead of sometimes getting caught up in staring at weather bell graphics on end in a loop and just thinking that's the way I'm going to forecast the weather. This is kind of old school. Get out the pen and paper and the colored pencils and start coloring in contours.
Brad, that's a great point, because it's almost like the models get you there, but you kind of have to get yourself out of it, because you just don't know. It may be stronger, and it may take longer for you to get in and out of a wedge situation.
All right, one final question to the whole panel. Any forecasting tips for those people out there? I know Brad mentioned the comment modules for the people who are in this area and like to try to forecast it, or anything, tricks of the trade you can give them.
That was Ricky trying to get some tips right quick.
Hey, I think the great thing is look at case studies. I'm a big fan of looking at previous events. The analogs are great. Oh man, the SIPS analog page is phenomenal for looking for events like this. But learn to love Buffkit. Buffkit, morning, noon, and night. You have got to be a Buffkit fan to forecast cold air damming, because it will save your behind. And really just, I think the comment modules will help you a lot, and the case studies, but the Buffkit, to me, I can't forecast around here at all without Buffkit, just because of the uniqueness of this area. So if I didn't have the sounding data, model data, which a lot of people never look at, they always look at, they look at the maps in 2D. I like looking at the atmosphere in 3D, and that's a good way to kind of look at and approach things.
I think that's what you got to do, like what Brad said. You really got to, look at past events and understand that how important that cold air is coming in from Canada. If the center of that high is not in the right place, then you're not going to get that cold air coming down. You've got to have that cold air in place first before you really start to bring in some type of moisture or some type of precipitation. And if you're looking at trying to understand, because the Miller A's, the Miller B's, and how these coastal fronts, sort of get this cyclogenesis going and bring in, that low, or you get some sort of phasing of an upper level trough coming in from the west. There really is, like what Brad was saying earlier, there's so many different ways that this cold air damming can come to be. So, case studies and really understanding what is it meteorologically that creates that event to have it come to be.
All right. Anyone else?
I would say it's just chiming in on everything else that's been mentioned. In these types of events, the SKUTs are very important to look at. And we, sometimes you get in a rush when you're forecasting on a nice day and you don't take time to do that, but you can't afford not to take time to do that when you see an event like this happening. And I would throw out there, I don't know if anybody's seen the European model tonight, the 12Z run, but there is a classic cold air dam on their model for next weekend. So I don't, who knows, but it's definitely very noticeable when you look at it that far out.
And I was just going to say, along with Buff Kit, because that saved my butt a lot of times now, but in senior year, so last year when I was at NC State. But also going back to any textbooks you have or the common modules, Ricky, seriously, that textbook is going to become your Bible. We had a hashtag in our class that was Gary Lackman president, because it helped us so much getting to learn the nitty-gritty details of it. So I guess I'm pretty much just echoing what Brad, Rich, and Grant said, but just getting down to the basics and then taking advantage of some software packages.
All right, sounds good, folks. Next week, as I think you guys kind of alluded to, some really cold air coming in. If you want to chime in on that and potentially what we could see around here from that, maybe a cold air damming event, as Rich mentioned.
Yeah, before I go, I'll put a plug in for my blog because I blogged about this morning. The cold air next week is fascinating. This is one of those events where you see a lot of cool things, and you figure out real quickly that local weather is sometimes connected to something worldwide. Recurving typhoons, major lows in the Aleutian chain, all kinds of cool things. Even the dreaded polar vortex word is going to be thrown out here in the next 7 days. And in this case, it's actually a little bit closer to legitimacy than I've seen it used in the past. But yeah, next week is going to be interesting. WX Brad is my blog. I wrote a quick little piece on what I think is going to happen next week. But Rich brings up a good point. I've been keeping an eye on the Euro. The GFS is bad enough, but the European model is just brutal next week. And it tends to do really well in these long-range events. As you get closer, the GFS and the NAM catch up like we saw with last weekend's snow. But when I see the European pegging something like this 7 days out, I take notice immediately.
Yeah, the European, I'll chime in. It was, I looked at it, I was forecasting over the weekend, not this past weekend, but the one before, and I saw the upper low there, and I thought, this thing is going ballistic. It just did not look legitimate, didn't look realistic, and sure enough, it ended up being pretty close to its original forecast.
Sorry, Ricky and I are topping back and forth to each other. Grant, do you guys do you have anything for next week as we're looking at the next system coming in?
You know, I mean, I think it really is fascinating because on Monday, you know, Tim Buckley, our weekend meteorologist, you know, he was looking at what was going on out in the West Pacific with that typhoon. I forget the name of it. Was it Nadi or something?
I think it's Nuri or something.
Yeah, Nuri.
Nuri. Anyway, so when I came in on Monday, he was like, "So, do you think this is gonna impact our weather?" And at first you're like, no. And then you sit there and you think about it. You take out a hemispheric map and you start looking at that stuff, and you're like, well, that's cool. You know, it really is. You know, despite what it's going to bring to us, the fact that you can track, the impact of this incredible typhoon halfway around the world and watch it, inject some sort of energy into the jet stream and have that domino or that whipping effect, causing there to be an enhanced trough over the eastern half of North America, is pretty fascinating. And I mean, it obviously the models are going to be a little bit slow to grab onto, especially in the statistical, because you get that far out and they're just looking at Climo. But when you look at the Euro and even the GFS, it really does look like this trough just digs, and you have to think, yeah, that was a pretty strong typhoon, so that's a pretty strong hit to that jet stream. And so we're probably going to be watching even colder temperatures, I think, diving south out of Canada than even what the models are suggesting right now. And actually, just today, I'm sitting there, I'm putting together my forecast and looking at that 7th day going to next and the models, I've got my sheet right here. I mean, the GFS was saying 64 degrees for next Wednesday, and the more I looked at it, I'm just thinking there's no way. There is absolutely no way that it's going to be in the mid-60s. So, I went from 64 for what the model was saying to, I think I'm forecasting 56 for next Wednesday, and it couldn't be even colder than that. So we'll see.
And Rich, what kind of with you down in the Midlands and the Georgia area? What are you expecting for next week?
Well, it's obviously a very cold-looking pattern, especially for this early in the year, and given what we've already seen, nothing would surprise me. So I'm preparing for definitely a cold week for probably the second half of next week into the weekend. Definitely, though, we're going to see a cool down compared to what it has been even today. We were in the upper 70s today, and it's definitely going to be cooling down for the rest of this week, but certainly nothing dramatic like what could happen next week. Just kind of an interesting way to start off. I know it's not technically winter yet, but we'll call it the winter season. It's been very active so far since really November 1st, and it's just going to be interesting to see what comes in the weeks ahead.
Hey, Rich, I want to ask you right quick. Have the areas in your TV market had their first frost or freeze yet?
Yeah, we had, when we had the snow the other day, we had not yet had a frost or a freeze. A couple of places had a little frost, but by and large, none of that until it was Sunday morning and Monday morning especially. We had a widespread freeze, and so most of the area, except for some of the urban areas, have seen a good freeze already.
All right, and Chris, do you have anything you want to add for what we could see next week?
It's going to be cold.
Yes, it is.
But no, yeah, we've been looking at it obviously here, and given recent events. Talking with my chief, he's going, I'm just waiting for snow to show up. So we'll have to see what happens. It's always fun to sit and watch not only where the 540 line lies, but also looking at critical thickness values with the lowest layer, the 1,850, the 850 to 700. Once you break down that partial thickness technique, it's really impressive to see how these systems have been evolving. So I'm looking forward to kind of playing a game of tug of war with the models. So it should be fun. So yeah, that's yeah, it's gonna be cold. That's all I got to say right now. So.
All right, guys, and we're running on time. I know Grant and Brad's got to get back to the station. So, Brad, I'll let you. I know you have to run because you have to actually get back to the station. So I'll let you plug social media and all that good stuff.
Yeah, you can find me at WXBrad on Twitter, Brad Panovich, WCNC on Facebook, Brad Panovich on Google+, WXBrad.com, WCNC.com. If you can't find me in a Google search, then I'm doing something wrong. I'll concur with these guys. It's going to be fun next week, and I'm glad Grant talked about the typhoon recurving, because if you guys look back at last weekend's snowstorm, if you know where that energy came from, it was actually the remnants of Hurricane Ana, because it was in the Central Pacific. So it's happened once already in the last week. I'm not going to be shocked to see this happen again next week.
Yeah, I retweeted Brad's picture of the Arctic oscillation going way negative, and I said, basically, layman's terms, somebody's going to turn on the AC for the East Coast. That's just what it's going to be.
But thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. We'll see you back in December as well. So, Brad's got to run, so thank him. Chris and Grant and Rich, I'll kind of let you guys plug social media if you want to, and then we're going to kind of wrap up the show from there. Chris, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. You can find me on Facebook. It's Chris Michaels, WCYB. On Twitter, at WCYB_Michaels. Then we've also got a blog that I'm doing on our website. That's just wcyb.com/weather. So yeah, looking forward to being in touch with more people, and I had an excellent time, learned a lot on tonight's discussion, as I always do, and I look forward to being on again.
Awesome.
We definitely suggest you go check out Chris's blog, because a lot of times it mentions things that we've actually talked about. So
yeah, and that's what it's going to be for next week. After tonight's discussion, I'm definitely going to talk about this stuff. It was really interesting.
And Mr. Gilmore, you're right beside Grant on my pictures, so I'll let you talk next.
Hey, Scotty, first of all, I want to say it was awesome having you in last week. Was that last week or was that 2 weeks ago?
It was 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago. Yeah, that was cool. If you guys are ever in the Greensboro area, give me a shout. We always love having people down here, and so Scotty got to come out and hang out with us for an evening, and it was pretty cool to have some of these Carolina weather discussion guys in the Triad. So you guys are always welcome here at WFMY, which is where you can find me. WFMY News 2, WFMYnews2.com is our website, but social media wise, Twitter is Grant_Gilmore, and then Facebook is just Grant Gilmore. I don't have anything special with there, but Facebook.com/Grant Gilmore. I'm, not limiting myself to weather in case that whole forecasting thing and the cold air damming thing doesn't work out. But I'm also on Instagram, which is Grant_Gilmore. So it's been a lot of fun, guys. I love talking about the weather, and especially when it comes to cold air damming. I'm glad to know that there's other people around these half of the United States that suffer with.
Yes, and Grant, again, thank you for letting you and Tim both. I had a great time and can't wait to do it again. And Grant and Tim, I have to give them the Meteorologist of the Year awards, because rain, sleet, snow, wind, hail, whatever the case may be, they are outside doing their weather all the time. They are awesome.
Weather garden out there, and I keep talking about February, but we started coverage at 4 o'clock, and we went live through the 11 o'clock news, and we did all of our weather coverage from talking about the 7-day to just live tracking the radar was out in the weather garden in the snow. So it's definitely in the element.
Grant, I think one question that I can't believe Ricky didn't ask you for this tip: how did you keep your hair through all the cold air damming forecasting?
I'll tell you, it's a great product. It's amazing. It's Paul Mitchell.
you should have shot that to Brad like 10 years ago.
Well, I'll tell you, my hair is falling out. It's definitely thinning up top. So Brad has a few years on me. I'm glad he's not on here anymore. But
And Grant, stick around because I want to ask you something. If you can, I'll just tweet it to you. We'll let Rich kind of plug himself, and hopefully we're going to invite him back on the show, and hopefully he will accept our invitation.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, and I've been watching a few of the ones I haven't participated in on YouTube. So definitely great discussions y'all are having. I'm on Facebook at meteorologist Rich Rogers. Twitter is @RichWeather, and that's the same on Rebel Mouse, which I got that idea to join that from Brad Panovich, and I know he wrote some information on that once before. And also Instagram is RichNBC26, and of course our website is NBC26.tv, not .com. .com is in Green Bay, Wisconsin, so we're NBC26.tv. And we get questions from Wisconsin a lot, but very similar addresses. But yeah, I just appreciate y'all having me on, and I look forward to coming back one day.
Yes, we want you back on, and if you dig up your blog that you wrote about cold air damming and send it to me, we will put it on our Carolina's Weather Group Facebook page for everyone to read. And,
okay, I'll go look for that as soon as we wrap up here.
Awesome, good deal. All right, guys. Well, we'll wrap up. We're going to kind of talk about the next few weeks for Carolina's Weather Group. Next week, we are actually going to be starting at 9 p.m. Instead of our regular 8 p.m. Show. We're going to be talking about, do you know the difference between watches, warnings, and advisories, and kind of how the public perceives them, with meteorologist Laura Mock from WHSV up in Harrisonburg, Virginia, as well as Nate Johnson with WRAL out of Raleigh. And then November 19th, Model Mania, GFS, Euro, NAM, all those weird words that we throw out there, with Jason Boyer from WLOS and Jamie Arnold from WMVF in Myrtle Beach. And then after that,
cage match.
Yes, it is. And we're also looking for another meteorologist to go on that show, if anybody wants to.
Anybody.
And after that, we're going to take a week off for Thanksgiving. And then, this is what I was wanting Grant and Rich to stick around for. December the 2nd, we are going to be having a recap of our one-year anniversary with Carolina's Weather Group. And I know Grant has been on our show several times, so we're trying to invite some of our panelists on to kind of just come and hang out and just talk about whatever. So we'd love to have you and Grant, you and Rich on for that show. And then the following day, we are going to talk about the winter outlook with Brad Panovich and Chris Michaels, and another meteorologist to be delayed. I think David's working on that.
Yes, I'm working on that, guys. I might have a surprise, somebody representing the coastal Carolinas for December 3rd. Still working on it, and maybe in the next week or two we can reveal that information.
Awesome. And then I'm going to hand it to Ricky because Ricky has two pretty awesome guests to talk about that's going to be coming up in December.
Yeah, December 11th and December 17th. We have kind of an action-packed 2 weeks for you there. December 11th, which is actually a Thursday, not our typical Wednesday date, we will have James Spann from ABC 3340 down in Birmingham coming on our show to talk a little bit about basically himself, what he does down there. With James, you never know where the conversation is going to go. So we'll see where that one progresses. I'm sure we'll mention severe weather and severe weather coverage. And then the week after, we'll have a good friend of James on the show, Dr. Marshall Shepard, the host of Weather Geeks on the Weather Channel, the former president of the American Meteorological Society, and a professor at the University of Georgia, coming on to talk a little bit about climate change and a few other topics related to the AMS. Should be a great 2 weeks.
And I can guarantee you that me and Scotty will mention last week's football game. Just
Yes, the Gators put out a huge surprise. So action-packed week, and then after Marshall, we're going to go off the air for 2 weeks for Christmas and New Year. So that kind of wraps up the year of 2014. I can't believe I just said that. It's hard to believe that this year has flown by so fast. But anyways, Grant and Rich, thanks for coming on tonight. And for Brad and Chris Michaels, thanks to those guys for coming on. You know the rest of us, you know how to get in touch with us, so I'm going to kind of close the show out as we really ran over time. It's 9:30, so thanks for watching Carolina's Weather Group, and we will be back on next Wednesday night at 9 p.m., not 8 p.m., but 9 p.m. with Nate Johnson and Laura Mike. Hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you next week.
And even though I don't have a rant tonight, I'm just going to have to say that my rant would probably be that we went an entire hour show about the cold air damming before we mentioned Gruffle. Come on. Who doesn't like Dippin' Dots? I mean, let's go. All right. Anyway, we're out. Bye,